You rolling?
Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, let me introduce Naomi Grin. Naomi is the daughter of Rabbi Hugo Grin, very, very well-loved rabbi in the UK, and a reformist rabbi, if I'm right, and also from the stories that you told me earlier, as a boy he was in Auschwitz. So you have very, very strong Jewish connections. But we have very weak Jewish connections. We've only recently discovered that we even have Jewish connections, really, because our dad didn't talk about them at all. But we discovered that our grandmother and our grandfather on dad's side are both were both Jewish Orthodox, quite strong Jewish people. Leon.
Did you suspect?
Well, we kind of suspected because we kind of looked Jewish, and it was the looking Jewish and wondering whether we were Jewish that sparked the Ancestry.com sort of search. And then my nephew from Australia found both Simi, as she called herself, and Leon and their graves, and he had been to the graves. So I took the kids to the graves a couple of weeks ago, and they loved being there and making that connection. It was really hard to find them because there's hundreds of graves in East Ham Cemetery, and it was difficult to find them. When we did find them, her grave was covered in green stones. Is there any symbolism to that?
The tradition is that when you visit a grave, you put a stone on it.
Ah.
So that would mean that people have been visiting her, which is nice to know that she hasn't been forgotten.
It was very sweet because Joe did it automatically. He picked up a stone and said, "I want to put a stone on her grave," which was very, very sweet. To Leon, he said, "You're very lucky, Leon, because you don't know Donald Trump."
Oh, that's lovely.
But it was really nice. What do you think, Erin? Erin, who's being the producer-director here today, did you think it was a nice thing to do?
Yeah. I didn't actually know about the tradition, and Joe just did it like he just picked up a stone. He was like, "I want to put this on Samelia's grave."
As if he knew from some deep memory.
The first thing that happened was that Joe said to Leon, "I hope you're in heaven now." And Erin said, No, he's not Christian, he's Jewish, so he wouldn't believe in heaven.
Well, Jews are ambivalent about that. There's no definite decision about an afterlife. So the idea is that after you die, you're gathered back up into the wings of God. But that's, I think, more or less understood metaphorically. And there are ancient Hebrew ideas of 3 layers of being, and there's Gehenna, which is hell. There's also a word in Arabic and I think in Turkish that's similar to that, and then there's Sheol, which is the middle area, and then at the top is where we are in the present. So there are ideas traditionally of a hereafter, but it's not in the same way as a Christian idea. And there's also no notion of the central idea in Jewish theology is that we are awaiting the arrival of a Messiah or a Messianic age, whereas in Christianity it's understood that we are in it already because Jesus came. So that's a central separation point between Jews and Christians.
Why don't Jews believe in Jesus?
There's no problem with the idea of Jesus as having been a first century rabbi in Palestine, but had he been the Messiah, the world wouldn't be as it is now.
Okay.
There was in the first century, if you go to the town of Tzipori in Galilee, which is where the first Christians were living, alongside the Jews compiling the Mishnah, which was one of the key canonizations of the culture in Palestine. that went with Jews into exile after 70. They were creating their separate cultures side by side in the cafes of Tzipori, or Sepphoris as it's known in Latin. And then, the ones following Jesus went in one direction, and the ones following Yehuda ben Hanassi, the leader of the Mishnah, went into a different direction. There have often been splits in Jewish tradition. In fact, there's a group of they're known as Karaites living in the Caucasus Mountains that you wouldn't even recognize now as Jews. They broke off at the time when the Jews introduced a very substantial reform, which they didn't accept, that on Friday nights we would light candles at the beginning of Shabbat. Before that, Jews had sat in darkness because they couldn't make fire on Shabbat. That was one of the prohibitions. And so this was a group that didn't accept the reform that you could light candles as Shabbat came in. And so they've ended up as a remote, isolated group now in the Caucasus Mountains.
As you say, we kind of suspected that there might be some Jewish blood in our family, but we recognise that Judaism is a matriarchal faith, and that because our mother wasn't Jewish, that we're not Jewish. But what does it mean for us as a family, as an extended family, to know that our grandfather and grandmother were both Orthodox Jews? Does that affect us in any way? There does seem to be some kind of Jewish DNA in us.
Well, certainly reform and liberal movements would accept you wholeheartedly, patrilineally as Jews. So while you would have difficulty persuading an Orthodox rabbi to conduct a wedding ceremony for you or to bury you, because they would want to see the marriage document of your two Jewish parents, or to see a conversion document of your mother, or see your own conversion document, you would now be accepted wholeheartedly in the movement that I grew up in, for instance. Although in the time when my father was alive, that wasn't an accepted practice. You had to go through a conversion process. What does it mean for you as far as Jewish DNA? Well, were Adolf Hitler now in power, he would look to the Nuremberg laws to define who would who would be murdered as a Jew, and that would be anyone with a Jewish grandparent. Were you to want to emigrate to Israel, then all you have to show is the qualification under the Nuremberg laws, which is a Jewish parent. So you might not be able to convince an Orthodox rabbi to marry you to somebody else who is Jewish under his understanding, but you could be killed for it and you could live in Israel for it. What does it mean as far as DNA goes? It's so interesting to think about it. I mean, for sure, all Jews have a mixture of DNA. They've done studies, genetic studies, of groups of tribes. For instance, the Lemba tribe in Africa, which understands itself to be one of the lost tribes of Israel, and they've found amongst its priests DNA that would identify them as connected to the Kohanim, the biblical caste of Jewish priests. But you know, if you checked your DNA, if you have Cohen blood in you, it might show that up. But we're all really there's obviously been mixing with local people along the way.
We're Schwartzes, I think.
How do you?
Because we're blacks, I guess we would be originally Schwartzes, wouldn't we?
Well, names are a relatively new phenomenon for Jews, because traditionally you were named as the son or daughter of your father. So, what was your father's name?
Charles Black.
So, you would be, maybe he would have a Hebrew name. Jews always have a Hebrew name, and that's the name when you're called up to read from the Torah in the synagogue. They call you by your Hebrew name. It's given to boys at their Brit Milah, at their circumcision, and it goes on their tombstone. And so maybe Charles was Chaim. That's a typical, you might take Charles from Chaim, which means life. So you would be Paulo Ben Chaim, which means Paulo, son of Chaim.
Okay.
And so the Schwarz, or black, that really didn't come into play until the 19th century, when the census takers around Europe were keen on giving people surnames. So the typical story would be that somebody would turn up in a village and give all the Jews their sort of secular surnames.
In all the time I knew my dad, whose name was Charles Anthony Black, in all the time I knew him, he never once discussed being related to Judaism in any way. It never arose, so it wasn't something that I ever asked myself or questioned. I can understand why he would have hidden it in World War II, perhaps. But
Where was he?
He was sent to Burma. He had his 21st birthday in a ditch in Burma, being overrun by Japanese soldiers. Things were tough, but I wonder why after then it wasn't anything that ever arose.
Do you know if he stayed in contact with his parents?
He stayed in contact with his mother a little bit, and she sent me birthday cards and things like that initially when we first emigrated to Australia. I was only 6 years old and my sister was 1, and so she kind of knew me a little bit, but I can only remember her as being a quite large lady, and she always wore black, and I'm assuming that's because her husband had died in 1943, so I never got to meet Leon. But Samilia, I just remember her being a nice, warm, generous person who always wore black. And that's as much as I remember, but he said nothing.
Did you ever ask him about his parents?
No, and then because he died when I was 25, so, and I'm the eldest, so for the others, they would have even less of a memory of him and the associations.
I mean, there was a lot of attempt to assimilate. There was a lot of anti-Jewish, anti-German sentiment. So if you had a German-sounding name, maybe if the family name was Schwartz, that would be something that you would want to.
No, it goes back quite a long way. Black. And I think his grandfather was Charles Black too. So and they owned a pub somewhere in East London, and that was kind of fun. And Dad was his grandfather Leon was a greengrocer, and Mum, his wife was a stay-at-home mum, and she had children, and they died quite young.
I know of my mother's parents, who were originally Josh Silberberg from Antwerp. He came as a refugee from the First World War as a child, and his family had come from Poland to Belgium. They were Yiddish speaking, and a big, large Yiddish speaking family. His mother had died in childbirth, so his widowed father brought most of his 13 children over to London at the outbreak of the First World War. And in the 1930s, he formally changed his name from Josh Silberberg to John Selby. And he was at that time trying to make his way as a dress designer. And I imagine he felt in the 30s that having a foreign Jewish sounding name would hold him back in business. So in fact, I've got here the prayer book that their rabbi gave them at their wedding, my grandparents at their wedding, and you can see where they've cut out the name Silberberg so that you can see and written behind it in the space Selby. So, and he changed it by deed poll. So even though his many brothers and sisters still called him Josh, he was henceforth and forever to be known as John. And it was very important for them that their daughters had elocution lessons. My mother, they spent the Second World War in Radlett. They were the only Jewish family. And my mother was at St Albans High, where she was taunted and asked if she had horns. So there was a lot of anti-Semitism in Britain, regardless of how history's been revised, so that it now seems as if Britain entered the Second World War in order to look after the Jews being persecuted by the Germans. That wasn't really how things felt then. So maybe your father was ashamed. Also, the Jews in the East End were poor, and the stink of poverty taints you generation after generation. I don't know if he went to Australia. He went to Australia before the Poms, before the £10 Poms.
No, he was a £10 Pom. So that was 1956. We went to Australia, and he was a £10 Pom, so it cost us 20 quid for the whole family to go.
As did Peter's parents. They met on the ship going as £10 Poms.
Oh, there you go.
So
that's your partner, Pete.
My partner, Pete.
Yeah.
So, Australia would have represented, I imagine, I'm speculating, would have represented a chance to start again.
A hope for the future.
I don't know if there was xenophobia in Australia, whether people who appeared to be more English in their background moved faster in the 50s and 60s. And the funny thing about being Jewish, for most Jews, I mean, there are many Jews with dark skins, but most Jews have European looking skins. So although you describe yourself as looking Jewish, it's a sort of vague thing. You can pass for white European, and all you have to do is change your name and not mention it, and you can avoid people giving you a rough time. I mean, right now, as you know, there's been a sort of shift in how people feel about about Jews in this country.
Why is that? What is it about people of the Jewish faith that makes people want to attack them?
It goes very deep. The first pogrom against Jews in this country happened in 1190 in York, when the bishop made a sermon, the local bishop made a sermon that made the Christians in his church so angry that they ran out and chased the Jews into a nearby castle where the Jews hid, and eventually killed themselves rather than be lynched by the mob. And there were many attacks on Jews in this country. They were officially exiled from here well before Isabel and Ferdinand did it in Spain and Portugal. So Jews have never been officially readmitted into Britain. They started coming back in small numbers from Cromwell's time. And there were always some hidden Jewish families. There were supposed to be about 10 hidden Jewish families in London during the time of the Tudors and Stuarts. There was a very well-known case against the Queen Elizabeth's doctor, Lopez, who was accused of treason. So he was definitely foreign. He was probably he was sort of Portuguese origin, and he was considered to have dual allegiance. And eventually, Elizabeth had to cave in to attacks on him from the Earl of Leicester, and eventually had to agree for his execution, and that caused enormous exploration in 16th century British society. And at about that time, Shakespeare wrote Shylock, Merchant of Venice, and Marlowe wrote Jew of Malta, and those are very dark, negative Jewish archetypes, very deep in British culture.
Do you think that's still the case today?
Well, the old tropes are being thrown up. There's always the two ideas. On the one hand, Jews are behind the communist plot. We have buried 10 minutes from here Karl Marx, who was baptized as a Christian, but he was definitely Jewish in his origin, and a lot of the leading communists were also Jewish, and then also the bankers. A lot of the leading bankers, like the Rothschilds and the Warburgs, were Jewish. So you often have people very confused whether they despise Jews for being able to lend them money, or whether they despise them for threatening to strike against the factory workers. So people get very confused about why they dislike the Jews, but it's an easy target really, because it's traditionally Jews are studious people. The reason why they became sometimes bankers and doctors was because those were the only two things allowed to them in English society. The Christians weren't allowed to lend money, and Jews were. Jews who came with William the Conqueror helped finance the building of the cathedrals, and periodically, if you wanted to write off your debts as a king or an aristocrat, you only had to find some spurious grounds to round up the Jewish moneylenders, and whoa, you were free from your debts. Send the moneylenders off to the tower, and you were liberated. But those stories hover around. So
what's the basis of all that? I know you said it was like ingrained, and you told the York story, which is very powerful. But what is it about? Is it just slightly different colour? Is it the way perhaps the nose is slightly bigger? Is there some feature about Jewish people that makes people a bit nervous of them, scared of them?
Well, that other great Jewish thinker, Freud, who talked about the Oedipus complex. Could it be the child culture, Christianity, and then Islam as the children cultures from Judaism, trying to kill the father, maybe? Or kill the mother, even. If you think of Judaism as the mother culture. Is it, stories like Jacob and Esau, of Jacob stealing Esau's birthright? Maybe that's also deep in Christian culture. You don't see much anti-Semitism in Asia, and there's been a long tradition of Jews living in India, small community, but still they live very peaceably with their Hindu and Sikh neighbours for many centuries. So to my mind, and I don't speak as an authority here, it's where Jews have been living amongst Christians and now Muslims that there has been hatred. And also the stink of poverty goes deep, and in many parts of Europe, Jews were very poor, living off the land and living apart. There's a lot about Jewish traditional being that demands separation. So, for instance, circumcision defines Jews away from an uncircumcised population. Kashrut, the way you prepare, kill your animals and prepare your food and what you may eat or not eat, the 19 species that you're permitted to eat, that also separates you. One of the central ideas that you may not cook the calf in the milk of its mother. In other words, you don't mix milk with meat. In the time of the Canaanites, it was traditional amongst other Canaanite populations to very much prepare a sacrificial meal of the calf cooked in the milk of its mother. So for Jews to introduce a tenet prohibiting that would be to define themselves away from the Baal worshippers or the Canaanites. In fact, when I was trying to make my mind up about kashrut at an earlier part of my life, one of the reasons why I decided consciously against keeping strict kashrut was because I never wanted to be in a position where I couldn't eat off the plates of my friends and neighbours. So at a time when I was toying with more rigorous religious observance, I made a decision against separation. But so these are things that Jews do that mean, and of course marrying amongst themselves, burying in their own space, their own grieving rites and rituals, which separate Jewish communities from other traditions amongst whom they're living. That can generate grievance.
Trying to be part of the general community is always going to insert that kind of difficulty, isn't it, in terms of whatever it is that you want to follow. I know when you were making the decision about what you could and couldn't eat, my eldest son, who's almost 21 now, he when he was about 8, 9, he was vegetarian. We'd all been vegetarian. And he said, I don't want to be a vegetarian anymore because it's really difficult when I visit friends that they have to prepare something just for me. I want to eat what they're eating. So I can kind of relate to what you're saying about making a decision about whether or not you should be part of the community or separate from the community. And I can see that separation caused issues hundreds of years ago.
Sure, and you can see why someone who doesn't want to be isolated and sort of find difficulties might want to hide it if they think they can. And Shabbat observance, that's a tough one for people who, I can see why a lot of people if you find you don't really believe in God. I mean, the Jewish idea around God and faith is, in a nutshell, to practice and then see if faith follows. So, but sometimes people might look and think, why shouldn't I smoke on Shabbat, go to work? Why should I have to go to synagogue? It's boring. I don't want to hear from the Torah. And to separate yourself out from Shabbat observance is to part company with Orthodox Judaism, because you can't be non-observant of Shabbat and accepted. So a very religious community demands an awful lot of rigorous adherence to be included. And some of the things are quite extreme. I am so relieved I had a girl child, because I really don't know if I could have tolerated a circumcision, and I am the daughter of a rabbi. And I would have used, had we have had a boy, I would have probably used that her father is not Jewish and not circumcised to justify the decision I already made a long time ago that I wouldn't have circumcised a child of mine.
I was circumcised, but I remember my mum saying it was just a time when everybody was circumcised. Right. But I suspect that it probably, in retrospect, had more to do with being Jewish. But to be honest with you...
And to look like your father.
And to look like my dad. But I do think it's barbaric, and I do think that that little piece of skin is kind of important, because it protects your penis from, rubbing up and down against your jeans or whatever. It's when you're young, it's kind of nice to have that bit of skin there, I imagine. So I didn't have either of my boys circumcised, but then I had to have that discussion again, certainly with the mother of the baby boy, because she's Muslim. So again, she was saying, well, are we going to have him circumcised or not? And the answer was, no, it's barbaric.
And how did she feel about that?
She wasn't very happy about it, but she accepted it, which was nice. And she accepted too my point that that it didn't have any real benefits. My mother used to say that it had health benefits because it kept that area clean.
And there is evidence that until Jewish women started mingling with non-Jewish men, there was 0 incidence of cervical cancer amongst Jewish women, as with nuns. So that's an interesting correlation, has that got something to do with, whereas Jewish women have a very high preponderance of breast cancer, they have a very low preponderance of cervical cancer traditionally.
And why is that so? Why do you have a high incidence of breast cancer? Where does that come from?
That's a genetic link. There's some specific Jewish genetic disorders. There's one called Tay-Sachs, which comes from when both parents have a tendency to it. And then there is what's known as the BRCA1 gene, which is very prevalent amongst Ashkenazi Jewish women.
Was that the thing that Angelina Jolie had that she was concerned about?
Right.
And that she had her breasts, both of them, removed so
right.
that in case it happened.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I've chosen not to have the genetic study because I don't really want to have that decision. I have to make that decision.
It's hard, isn't it? What do you think is the best thing about being Jewish?
For me, my favourite Jewish company are Jewish intellectuals and writers from the past. So I can read forever the work of Bruno Schultz or Isaac Bashevis Singer or Joseph Roth or I love, I mean, if you just look on my shelves, reading Cecil Roth's History of British Jews. I love the history, the tradition, the way through a path of history with a specific perspective. You're asking me. Somebody else might say it's the chicken soup. I also like the chicken soup. And now I have a child. I am amazed at how much I'm really enjoying going back into Jewish observance or Jewish ritual through and for her. I had started to loathe some of the festivals like Purim, which I saw as being very racist. But through her eyes, when it's an opportunity for dressing up and eating pastries, it becomes something quite different. And cannot believe how much I'm enjoying the fact that she's now going to Sunday school, religious school, Cheder, and she's learning the Aleph Bet. I cannot believe how much I'm enjoying my new role as no longer as the daughter of the rabbi, but as the parent of the child at the Sunday school. I mean, I had thought that would be very uncomfortable, but I can't believe how much I'm enjoying it. So it's about passing on through generations a system of values, and the values are about charity and community and family. There's a lot of power invested in the home. It's a tradition where the synagogue element is very important, but the home is just as important. And you can see the table, the family table, and for instance the Shabbat ritual as being like the table of the high priest. You know, the work that was done to pack up the culture of the temple and the priestly caste and the nationalism of pre-exile Palestine, the work that was done to reduce that into a collection of books and some traditions with which Jews could then go out into the diaspora and then for the next 2,000 years unpack wherever they landed, unpack in a little meeting place and in their homes the traditions that had been developed. You know, that's really extraordinary. And the fact that, you know, sometimes when you're singing a melody, this melody goes back many hundreds of years. Also, there are traditions scattered amongst the observance that are so profound. Yom Kippur, for instance, one of my favourite days of the year. It is so powerful to spend 25 hours in a year really facing yourself in relation to a higher authority, seeing where you have missed during the year, cleaning your slate, starting again. You know, that's an extraordinary thing and to do it in community, and to know that you're doing it not just with your amongst the people with whom you're sitting, but that's ricocheting around the world. I mean, I found this year on the High Holy Days, Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, my mind was travelling around 5 continents to the Jews with whom I've become deeply befriended over the decades, and they're people with whom I don't get to spend much time in Australia, in America, in Israel, in France, in India, but you know, there are these points in the year when you can palpably feel each other's presence across a crowded globe. That's very powerful.
One of the very powerful stories that I remember you telling me some time ago was that when your dad was a boy in Auschwitz, he couldn't understand why his dad wanted to use the only fat that they had left to make candles. And of course candles to worship on, particularly on Hanukkah it was, I think. Why do you think that story resonates so strongly?
Because even in the darkness of a miserable winter in a slave labour camp in Upper Silesia, even there they were still trying to grasp hope. So hope is a very central idea in Jewish tradition. If you take Passover, the Seder plate, which you have at the central meal on the first night of Passover and the second night. It includes elements of spring, a roasted egg, and spring vegetables. This is the festival with which you conclude winter, if you like, or the hope that the spring will bring new life. The hope that after death there is some kind of enveloping despite all the struggles and pain of life and ill health and aging, that you might be enveloped in a sort of one love. Hope is very strong and central. So maybe people like this story of my father's from this miserable Hanukkah of 1944, because even there they were still hoping that by using this precious fat, which turned out to not even work because it was margarine, not butter, and margarine doesn't light. But even there, they were trying to remember their Jewish practice as if it would matter that one day they would get out of there and they would
something to
restart.
cling to.
Yeah, and they would restart their normal lives again.
Tell me what you think is the worst thing about being Jewish.
For me,
Yeah,
the goldfish bowl. For me, it's about being in a community, a claustrophobic community. If I go to Golders Green, I live now not so far from there, and I was there a few weeks ago looking for a lulav, which is the 4 species that you shake on Sukkot, as a sort of bring on the rain dance. And I was going to do a show and tell at Sadie's school, so I needed a lulav and I could go down there. And for me it's quite exotic being around these Orthodox Jews who live a much more rigorous Jewish practice than I do, but it makes me feel quite claustrophobic going into an Orthodox Jewish bakery to buy my chalot, although I buy a chalot every Shabbat, and we light candles and we bless the bread and we bless the wine. Nonetheless, I wouldn't like to feel that I have to do it. I wouldn't like to think that people are really bothered about who I spend my life with or whether I drove to synagogue. I would like to be free to make those choices and decisions. So that for me is the worst thing.
To conclude this interview, which has just been lovely, it's been so nice to chat with you, can you perhaps say anything else that you think that my relatives might benefit from in terms of knowing about their Jewish connection?
Start reading. There's so much richness in the history and tradition. Don't focus on the Holocaust. It's dark and terrible, and if you go down that path, it will just absorb you so completely that you won't be able to take on all the many joyous and wonderful aspects of your Jewish background and tradition. Though I would tell you to read my all-time favourite book, which is a Holocaust meets magic realism, called The Last of the Just. But I would say just start reading and learning about it, and see what it feels like to light candles, to light 2 candles on Friday night. You can pick and choose. You can pick and choose your observances. If something feels good or right for you, try it out and see what it's like. Try making some typical Jewish food that your grandparents would have eaten. There's Try making a chicken. Oh, you still don't eat meat. Okay, don't make a chicken soup.
But we did have lots of matzo bread.
Okay, that's a good one. I mean, it kind of bungs you up, so you want to have plenty of dried fruit at the same time. But let's think. Traditional Jewish food is quite heavily meaty, so maybe try more Sephardi Jewish dishes, which are more fishy, and also I find it so interesting to check in with local Jewish cemeteries and synagogues when I'm travelling. Go to Crete. There's a wonderful medieval Jewish synagogue that's been renovated in Chamia. And it gives you a wonderful sense of an alternative Jewish history. Or if you're in, maybe Australia is such a new country, I guess there's not much there to help you travel through time. Go to the Jewish Museum in Camden, where there's always a good exhibition. It's another way through history. That's what I would suggest. I think that for me, check out a synagogue. Check out what a service feels like. It's always interesting.
Naomi Green, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
You are welcome.